Alrighty, so let's continue on with the knight F6 for knight F3 line. So this is the Queen's Gambit, so D4, D5, C4, we have E6, knight C3, knight F6, and then knight F3. So this one is actually called, in chess.com, what is this one called? Knight F3 is called the Three Knights Variation. Well, when I hover my mouse over it, it says Three Knights Variation, but then in here, what does it say? English Opening, Anglo-Indian, Queen's Knight Variation. Not sure if that's accurate or not, if that's a mistake. All right, so what does it say here? This position very often occurs via, so a different move order. Let's go back. D4, knight F6, C4, E6, a Nimzo-Indian, knight C3, bishop B4 perhaps, and then white goes, no thank you, but I wouldn't mind a Queen's Indian, B6, or a BOGO, bishop B4. And then black plays D5. Well, now that you have put your knight on F3, I think I prefer a Queen's Gambit declined. And then white plays knight C3. Yeah, I like that interesting psychology there. Because knight F3 applies less direct pressure on black's central position than, for example, bishop G5, black now has a very large choice. The main lines are bishop E7, knight on B to D7, C5, bishop B4, and then also capturing D takes C4. Now, for C6 is also important, but this is one of the several move orders to reach the semi-Slav and will be dealt with in the next chapter. Okay? So let's look at bishop E7. Black's most classical move. Now 5, bishop G5, will take us back to the 4 bishop G5 lines, but white has an important alternative which rose to great prominence in the 1990s. Bishop F4. On the face of it, this move is less aggressive than bishop G5, but it has the great advantage of not overly encouraging standard simplifying maneuvers like knight to E4. So bishop G5 here, there is a move of knight to E4, but I don't even see it here. Knight E4, here it is. And this is what? Queen's Gambit decline, modern variation, bishop E7, knight F3. That's one option that's available. So on the face of it, this move is less aggressive than bishop G5, but it has the great advantage of not overly encouraging standard simplifying maneuvers like knight E4. Okay? Bishop F4. Black castle. And then white E3. Yep. All right, so up until the 21st century, the quote normal end quote moves, so 6, knight on B to D7, C6, and B6 had never really caught on. Most of the resulting middle game positions were regarded as just that little bit less attractive from black's point of view than with a white bishop on G5. However, in recent years, there has been a move among the world elite towards these slow moves, with knight on B to D7, and c5 in particular emerging as a major battleground. Only time will tell if this is just a question of fashion. In any case, black has instead an active move that is simply bad with a bishop on g5, but it is entirely feasible after bishop to f4, which is c5. Thus, it was only natural that this became the main line. With white's bishop on f4 instead of g5, black's d-pawn is safe. So after c5, d takes c5, and then bishop takes c5, so bishop moved twice. And what is this one called? So chess.com calls this the Queen's Gambit declined Harwitz mainline. White now has a choice of two fundamentally different plans. The first is to keep the position simple by exchanging on d5. The main line runs 8, c takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, e takes d5. And now both 10a3 and bishop d3 have been played. a3 basically stops black from playing bishop b4 check. After something like knight c6, bishop d3, bishop b6, castle, bishop g4, black has developed his pieces satisfactorily, but white may still hope to besiege the isolated d-pawn. The other option, 10 bishop d3, bishop b4 check, pursues the same strategy more fanatically, ignoring the somewhat precarious position of the white king and hoping to take advantage of the now rather loosely placed bishop on b4. The other and far more popular plan is not to worry about a possible d takes c4. You could play 8a3 or 8 queen to c2. Let's see. So instead of c takes d5, you could play a3 or queen to c2. Develop the queen side and increase the pressure on d5 later on. A critical position arises after a3, knight c6, queen c2, and then queen a5. And this is still the Queen's Gambit declined Harwitz mainline. Black's last move threatens knight to e4. And forces white to react. The oldest line in this position goes rook to d1, bishop to e7, knight to d2. But it does say that bishop to e2, interesting, exclamation, is the modern preference. So instead, knight to d2, allowing but also forcing black, in view of the threat of knight to b3, to lash out in the center with e5, bishop g5, and then d4. This variation was thoroughly examined and considered acceptable for both sides. Then in 1988, white on move 10 was the castle queenside was introduced. This became extremely popular almost overnight. So let's see. So on move 10, instead Instead of rook to d1, it's castle queenside. After bishop e7, both the ferocious attacking moves g4 and h4, and the more subtle knight to d2 and king to b1, all turned out to be very dangerous for black. It took a few years, but by now, black has managed to work out good defensive lines against all 4 of these moves, and the Queen's Gambit Declined is back from the intensive care unit, but it was mighty close. All right, so let's take a look at the knight f6, knight f3, knight on b to d7 lines. So d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, and knight on b to d7. Chess.com calls it the Queen's Gambit Declined 3 Knights Barman variation. This move has not yet established itself sufficiently to get a name. Well, I guess now it has a name. But it is a sound and flexible option which can be played with several ideas in mind. To begin with, it may be used as an anti-5 bishop f4 weapon, since on bishop f4, black now has the excellent reply d takes c4. The white bishop finds itself somewhat awkwardly placed after both e4, bishop b4, and also e3, knight to d5. So this is usually avoided. Against bishop g5, black has a choice between transposing to the 4 bishop g5 main lines by playing bishop e7 or h6, bishop h4, bishop e7. Although he has, of course, committed himself to the knight on b to d7 line. The Ragozin variation, the Ragozin variation, bishop b4, or the Cambridge Springs by c6, e3, and queen to a5. The critical test for knight on b to d7 is c takes d5, e takes d5, bishop f4. And what is this called? Queen's Gambit Declined, exchange, the Samish variation. Again, as in the variation 3 bishop e7, because there is a drawback to the natural reply bishop d6, in this case, of course, bishop d6, bishop captures, c captures, would be awkward. White is hoping to achieve a favorable version of the exchange variation. The whole of the knight on b to d7 line, although it has been known for quite some time, has somehow managed to stay clear of the theoretical steam rollers. This makes it an interesting choice for those who know their way about in the Queen's Gambit and can hope to lure their opponents into unknown territory. All right, next, the knight f6, knight f3, c5 line. So d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3, knight to f6, f6, knight to f3, c5. This is called the semi-Tarrasch variation, and it indeed bears a close superficial relationship with the line 3, c5. So chess.com, what does this call it? This calls it the Queen's Gambit declined 3 knights semi-Tarrasch defense. However, the name is at odds with the fact that Tarrasch was attracted to his opening, the Tarrasch defense, by the point that black is going to play e takes d5 if white ever takes on d5. While in the variation that we're discussing here, black's aim is to avoid an isolated queen's pawn. Hardly a strategy that Tarrasch would have approved of, let alone given his name to. But of course, chess opening nomenclature is not always logical. This is really a nice illustration of the fact. Yeah, that's interesting because in the Tarrasch variation, I believe he thought it was an advantage to have the isolated d pawn, or at least initially, and it wasn't a long-term weakness. He liked to have that advantage of the isolated d pawn in the center. But in this case, we're avoiding that isolated pawn, so it's kind of counterintuitive to having his name on it. However, the strategic idea behind the move, 4c5, is perfectly logical, and that is what counts. Black attacks the white center formation in a very straightforward way. C takes d5. Knight takes d5. This is the idea. The whole variation has actually more in common with a Gruenfeld defense than with the Tarrasch. Black challenges his opponent to occupy the center by playing 6e4, which actually looks like it is the #1 move. And it's called the Queen Gambit declined semi-Tarrasch mainline exchange variation. e4. Such an aggressive attitude is not to everyone's taste, however, and the rather more reserved options, we've got e3 and g3, have also grown into proper variations. So e4, knight takes c3, b takes c3, is obviously a critical line. However, after 7, c takes d4, bishop b4 check, bishop d2, bishop takes bishop, d2 check, queen takes d2, castle, black has developed very nicely, and it is not clear how strong white's central position really is. The main line goes 11, bishop c4, knight c6, castle, b6, followed by 13, black can play bishop b7. The position seems to be asking for a d5 breakthrough, but its consequences are far from clear. A good variation for players with strong nerves. Though outwardly less aggressive, 6e3 also offers white some attacking prospects. So instead of e4, e3. But of a different nature. In fact, he is inviting black to play c takes d4. When e takes d4 now gives white the isolated queen's pawn. So this is called the Queen's Gambit declined semi-Tarrasch mainline Pillsbury variation. Wow. Okay. It now gives white an isolated queen's pawn with all the latent attacking chances on the king side that go with it. Theory recognizes two main lines here. One is easy development, bishop e7, and then either bishop d3 or bishop c4. So we'll just do bishop d3. Knight c6, castle, castle, rook e1. And now, for instance, bishop f6. Okay. The other main line is more aggressive and rather tricky. So instead of 7 bishop e7, it's actually 7 bishop b4. Now after the natural queen c2, knight c6, white may fall into a trap by bishop d3, bishop a5, threatening knight on d to b4, a3, knight takes c3, b takes c3, knight takes d4, exclamation point, losing a pawn. But then black may find that this is actually rather unclear, for after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop b5 check, white has a considerable lead in development, which many players consider sufficient compensation for the material deficit. Nevertheless, most people avoid this by developing their king's bishop in a slightly less active way, namely 9 bishop e2, avoiding the knight fork on b4. Instead of bishop d3, 9 bishop e2, which avoids that knight fork on b4. Also, bishop d2 instead of queen c2 is often played. Okay. Next, the solid option, g3 on the 6th move. So instead of e3, g3. And what does chess.com call this one? The Queen's Gambit declined semi-Tarasha mainline. So white follows a completely different strategy here. Instead of trying to establish some sort of central dominance, he aims for a symmetrical position with a tiny lead in development and some pressure against b7. So after c takes d4, for instance, knight takes d4, it's a good move. Oh, sorry, not knight takes d4. So after c takes d4, knight takes d5, exclamation point. Queen takes d5, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, knight takes d4 is considered to be very slightly better for white. Theory at any rate prefers 6, knight to c6. All right, let's go back. So instead of c takes d4 for black on the 6th move, theory at any rate prefers knight to c6, bishop g2, and now c takes d4. If bishop e7, castle, brings us to a position discussed via the Keres-Parma variation of the English opening. Interesting, okay. Whereupon c takes d4, knight takes d4. If in this position, knight takes d5, question mark, queen takes d5, would now simply lose a pawn. Okay. So knight takes d4, knight takes c3, b takes c3, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, queen takes, c takes, which brings about an endgame with chances for both sides. White has some pressure against b7. But black's pawn majority on the queen side may eventually turn into a dangerous passed pawn. Yeah, black has two queen pawns and white only has one on the queen side. Okay. All right, let's take a look at this next variation. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, bishop b4. All right, so this is called the Queen's Gambit declined, the Ragozza the Ragozin variation, the Ragozin variation, a near relative of the Nimzo-Indian, which is only one move away with 5e3. Black aims for counterplay by c5, knight e4. Oh, sorry, not white. Black aims for counterplay by c5, knight to e4, or d takes c4. That is why white's best reply is thought to be c takes d5, e takes d5, bishop to g5. Now there are two main lines for black. We have knight on b to d7 and h6. So let's take a look at the knight on b to d7. Looks like h6 is the most popular, and knight on b to d7 about half as popular. We'll start with knight to b. Knight on 6b to d7. e3, c5, bishop d3 constitutes white's most natural development. Black then lashes out on the queen side with queen a5, queen c2, c4. This leads after bishop f5, black castles, white castles, rook to e8, to a difficult position. So this leads after these moves here to a difficult position. White's ideal plan would be to play e4, probably after knight to d2 and f3. But practice has shown that this is hard to achieve against an opponent who knows what he's doing. Still, this is white's most principled approach. Very often, however, white avoids this type of middle game altogether by playing on the 7th move, rook to c1. So on the 7th move, instead of e3, rook to c1, or queen to c2. White plans to radically stop c5 to c4. Oh, c5 and then c4. By taking on c5, should black play c5? For instance, after 7, white plays queen to c2, c5, d takes c5, queen to a5, bishop back to d2, exclamation point. The game assumes a totally different character from the e3 line. Though black is certainly not without his chances even here, these two moves have become quite fashionable of late. Okay. Next, let's do 6h6. Instead of knight on b to d7, we'll do h6. Forces white to make a decision. Should he take on f6? Or is bishop to h4 the stronger move? Well, the latter invites the sharp response. g5, bishop g3, knight to e4, threatening knight takes c3, as well as h5. White must deal firmly with this. Okay. The pawn sacrifice, knight to d2, exclamation point, knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop takes c3, rook c1 offers good attacking prospects, especially because if black plays bishop takes d4, question mark, it fails to queen a4 check, knight c6, rook takes c6. But exactly how good remains unclear. What is clear is that in practice, most players prefer the seventh move, bishop takes f6. So instead of bishop h4, bishop takes f6. Leading to a much more sedate middle game. The main line goes queen takes f6, queen a4 check, knight c6, e3, black castles, white plays bishop e2, bishop e6, castle. In comparison with the exchange variation, black's pieces are rather scattered all over the board, so it may look as if white's opening play has been successful, yet a Ragozin expert usually manages to re-coordinate them fairly quickly. All right, let's see how continue on here. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, and then d takes c4. This is one of the youngest variations of the Queen's Gambit complex. It was hardly ever played before the 1990s. Black immediately forced his opponent to make a fundamental decision. He can win back the pawn very easily with e3, probably followed by bishop takes c4, or even queen to a4 check. But both these moves transpose to another opening where white has then missed a number of options. So on the 5, e3, c5, bishop takes c4, a6. Is a Queen's Gambit accepted? It's called the Queen's Gambit accepted, the classical defense. And queen a4 check, c6, queen takes c4, b4 is a variation of the semi-Slav. What does chess.com say? It is a Queen's Gambit declined 3 knights Vienna variation. Though neither of these lines is bad for white, he may not like the choice of variation that has been forced on him. The more principled continuation is, all right, so instead of e3 or queen to a4 check, e4, bishop b4, bishop g5, c5. This is called the Vienna variation. Yep, Queen's Gambit declined 3 knights, Vienna variation. A line that enjoyed a certain popularity in the 1930s, was completely forgotten for half a century, but came back with a vengeance in 1987 when it was rejuvenated and analyzed very deeply. It is a provocative way to handle the opening because at first sight, white appears to have a great number of very attractive possibilities. Black's position turns out to be remarkably resilient. However, and white's straightforward aggression may also create a few weaknesses in his own camp. At any rate, it is a real tactician's variation. The first move to catch the eye is 7e5. This was met in the 1930s by c takes d4, whereupon queen a4 check, knight c6, castle queenside, bishop d7, knight e4, bishop e7 back to e7. E takes f6. G takes f6. Leads to a highly complicated position where black seems to have sufficient compensation for the sacrificed piece. The modern rejoinder to 7e5 is, for black, is h6. So let's see. So e5, h6. E takes f6. H takes g5. F takes g7. Rook to g8. This too has held up reasonably well in practice. Then there's the alternative for white, 7 bishop takes c4. So instead of e5, bishop takes c4. Seemingly simple and strong. White makes no immediate attempt to crush his opponent and instead relies on his lead in development to give him the initiative. Yet here too, things have turned out to be not that simple. The critical position arises after c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes check, b takes, and then queen a5. Talking to this bishop over here and this pawn. White now has tried knight to b5. If bishop takes f6, queen takes c3 check, king to f1, the idea being to meet queen takes c4 check, and then if king g1, and if g takes f6 question mark, rook c1. So 10, bishop b5 check. So instead of capturing bishop b5 check, years of intensive research have not produced a clear main line. Interesting.